Hello and welcome to the Smart Divorce podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr Supriya McKenna. She is a specialist expert in Narcissistic Personality Disorder, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about her before we get chatting. But before I do so, welcome Supriya, lovely to see you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on.
My absolute pleasure. So Supriya is a former GP and one of the UK's leading experts in the field of narcissistic personality disorder. She works exclusively in the area of narcissistic relationships. This is not very easy to say, I have to say, including the areas of separation, divorce, and post-separation abuse. She works directly with victims of such relationships and regularly trains family lawyers, mediators, and other professionals on how to manage clients, co-workers, or bosses with narcissistic personality disorder. She's the co-author with top UK lawyer Karin Walker of two highly acclaimed books, Divorcing a Narcissist, The Lure, the Loss and the Law, and Narcissism and Family Law, a Practitioner's Guide, which I have just ordered.
Oh, brilliant.
Because it looks very useful. She also co-hosts a very popular podcast, Narcissists in Divorce, The Lure, the Loss and the Law. You can find her at websites thelifedoctor.org and on narcissistanddivorce.com. And we'll put those links in the show notes so that you can get hold of her should you need to. So let's get cracking. So shall we start off by, could you tell us more about what narcissistic personality disorder is?
Yeah, sure. Lots of people are getting this slightly wrong because obviously these days we tend to use it as a buzzword. So, you know, we tend to use that word narcissist as someone who's just a bit mean or a bit vain or a bit selfish, or, you know, someone who drives a sports car, or, you know, it's very active on social media, that kind of thing. Yeah. And that actually, it actually undermines the seriousness of what a narcissist really is, because actually a real, and you'll know this from your work with these types of people, but a real narcissism is actually narcissistic personality disorder. And that's actually a real diagnosable condition. Yeah. With lots of criteria. So, you know, there's lots of diagnostic criteria that I'm not going to go through because it's far too sort of boring and dry. But what I will say is that I think of narcissism as being a condition of low empathy with a sense of entitlement. And that, of course, is very important when it comes to the finances, as I'm sure you realize. Yeah. And the narcissist also has an addiction to feeling special. So they need to feel special. So if you sort of put those three things together, the low empathy, the sense of entitlement, and that addiction to feeling special, what that leads them to do is actually to exploit other people. And they do that in ways that are actually abusive. But it can be very, very subtle indeed. So that's kind of how narcissism kind of appears. But really, you have to go a bit deeper than that to understand it. So it's really, really important to understand that at the heart of narcissistic personality disorder, you've actually got a person with really, really low self-esteem. And that doesn't come across when you look at them. On the outside, it usually doesn't look like that at all. Most often, it doesn't look anything like that. And you know, if you were to sort of, and when I give talks, I always say to the audience, you know, could anybody who sort of secretly feels as though they're a bit special, would you please raise your hand? And of course, nobody raises their hand. Why would you? You know, but the point is that actually most people, it's actually normal. Most people secretly feel as though they're a bit special, and it's normal, and so it's okay, because I can see you sort of going, you know, so yes,
very good.
Okay, you're fine, you're normal. Exactly. So it's normal to secretly feel as though you're a bit special, and it's good for you. It means that you live longer. It means that you're healthier. It means that your mental health is better, your physical health is better, that your relationships are better, you know, so all round it's a good thing. And that's kind of where it differs from NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, because a narcissist actually secretly feels as though they're not special. And of course, it's that secret feeling they're not special, which is, you know, which is why you don't see it on the surface. And so leading on from that, because they secretly don't feel as though they're special, what they do is they put up a sort of false image to the outside world. And that's called a false persona. And they need other people to externally validate that false persona. So they need other people to believe in that false persona and to kind of adore it or whatever. They need to validate that false persona. And they need to do that so that the narcissist can believe in it themselves. So if other people can believe in it, they can believe in it themselves, and then they don't have to face those feelings of, inadequacy and shame and unworthiness and low self-esteem. So it's quite sort of convoluted, but when you get your head around it, and it's important to really, if you really want to understand narcissism, and if you want to manage narcissists, it's understanding that's key. But going on from that, that external validation that I talked about, that's actually got a name, and it's called narcissistic supply. And it's kind of like fuel. That's kind of the fuel that a narcissist needs. And it's so important to get this concept. So they get that narcissistic supply, that external validation, from either being adored, from getting attention, or from drama, very important in divorce, conflict, very important in divorce, or even instilling fear into other people, feeding off people's emotions. That gives them narcissistic supply, whether that be, positive emotions or negative emotions. It doesn't matter. It's all supply, and they need it. I mean, they need it because they are addicted. They need to feel, they're addicted to feeling special so that they're not, feeling the truth about themselves. And the last thing I need to say about this, and then I'll shut up and let you ask me, is that narcissistic supply is like a bucket with a hole in it. So it's constantly leaking out. So the narcissist constantly needs to refill it. And so they've got loads of people. So if you imagine, if you can visualize that bucket with a hole in it, and then loads of watering cans, and each watering can is a different person. So one might be the spouse, one might be the boyfriend or the girlfriend, one might be the daughter or the son or the parent or the friend or the co-worker or the girl in the shop, or, every single person that a narcissist comes across is a source of narcissistic supply. They're a separate watering can. And when you remove one of those watering cans, and the biggest and most important watering can is usually the spouse, when you remove them in divorce or separation, of course, they take a big hit in what's being poured into that bucket. So their narcissistic supply drops, the levels drop. And so they need to do something to get them back up again, get it back up again, because that false persona is now crumbling, and they can't deal with that at all. So they react with rage. And that rage is what causes them it quickly tops up the narcissistic supply because of the fear and the drama and the conflict, etc., that it causes. And it's what drives that the situation with narcissists in divorce. That's why it's so awful for the spouse of a narcissist in divorce, because actually the narcissist wants to kind of annihilate the spouse. So wow, that's the quick version. That's as quick as I can give it to you.
That's really good. I mean, I do have lots of questions just from your introduction. So I suppose my first question is around, is this something that, as far as we know, that people are born with, or is it something that develops over time through external influences such as trauma or something, or do we not know that yet?
Yeah, no, the thoughts are that it's mostly nurture and not so much nature.
Right.
The vast majority of it's nurture. So it's the way it starts off in babydom and childhood. And it's the way that the narcissist's brain becomes wired as a baby or a child in response to an adverse upbringing. So there's various types of upbringings that can cause it. Like if you've got a belittling, critical parent, they kind of internalize the message that they're useless, and it kind of gets wired in. And then they need other people to sort of give them that validation to feel okay. Or it can be that they've got a narcissistic parent. So they kind of learn narcissism. And so they're just they become wired like that because they've got to sort of tiptoe around that narcissistic parent. So all those workarounds that they develop become wired in an early age, and then they kind of become narcissistic themselves. It could be that the parent just gave them conditional love. So, you've got to be grade 8 violin by the time you're 4. You've got to be, there's lead in all the school plays. You've got to get top marks and everything, and if you don't, we're going to ignore you or not give you any love. And so, of course, then everything becomes dependent on that conditionality of it. And again, that's external validation. And the other way that people say that you can get it, and I'm not quite sure about this one because it seems to me that the other ones seem to be stronger influences, but it's that whole golden child thing. So, you know, that the self-esteem movement where it's, you know, my special, you know, my clever little princess, my special little prince, and there's no kind of achievement for that, but they're told that they're marvelous and special and they should expect the best. And so apparently that's another way in which narcissism can form. I think the other three ways that I've described it are more important than that, but I have no evidence for that whatsoever. So, but that's my opinion.
It's interesting, isn't it? And so from the, well, both, in fact, all of those sort of developmental ways that you might become a narcissist or become affected by narcissistic personality disorder, I guess we could say. How do you recognize that in a relationship sort of early on, or does it usually not appear until later?
Well, it's really, really hard to spot it in the early days. The reason being that characteristically the narcissist becomes the perfect person for you. So they're very, very good at picking up on what it is that you need, what you want, how you express love, for example, and reflecting that back at you. That's kind of part of, that's why it's so difficult. So in the early stages, they literally appear. I mean, there's a Taylor Swift lyric, which I always quote, and she says, "Darling, I'm a nightmare dressed as a daydream." And that, I just think that sums up, you know, narcissism perfectly. It's the nightmare dressed as a daydream. You think you're in your daydream, but actually it turns into a nightmare because they're the perfect person to you. So for example, if you're the kind of person that expresses your love through giving gifts, they'll shower you with gifts. You know, if you like to spend a lot of time with someone, they'll spend every waking moment with you and all your values and your beliefs, and they'll reflect them back to you, and you will think you've met your soulmate. That's usually what people say. I thought I met my soulmate. It's not always the case, but that's usually the case. So hard to spot in the early stages.
Yeah, it sounds that way. So is there something that happens in a relationship which turns the person with the disorder so that they kind of, I don't know if it's letting their guard down or kind of almost removing the like letting the mask slip a little bit?
Well, it's interesting, you know, I was saying you start off with that love bombing stage. That's the first stage, love bombing. The real word for it is idealization, where they put their partner on a pedestal. You know, the narcissist puts their partner on a pedestal, and they genuinely believe that they're perfect, etc., at that point. But then the next part of the cycle, and it is a cycle, is the devalue stage. So it's the cycle of idealize and devalue. So what happens next, and this could be weeks or months down the line, or sooner, is that they'll make sort of the odd critical comment, you know, maybe disguised as a joke, and they'll sort of, you know, you look a bit fat in that, or your arms look a bit fat in that top, maybe wear at the top with the longer arms, or, you know, whatever it is, if you're, you know, obviously a bit touchy about your weight, or whatever your particular bit of touchiness is, they'll find it, and they'll just sort of say something kind of, you know, mildly critical. And what happens then is obviously your heart sinks and you think, oh, I'll go to the gym, or I'll dress differently, or I'll, you know, I'll be better. I don't, you know, it was wonderful before, and you know, I don't want to feel like this. I want to get back to where we were before, you know. Bearing in mind that in that love bombing phase, your brain has been flooded with all those feel-good neurochemicals, and in that devalue stage, they've come crashing down. So what happens next is that you go back into the love bombing stage, or the idealization stage, and it might never be as big as it was before, you know, or it might be, you know, but you're roped back into this kind of wonderful, you know, honeymoon phase again, and you think, phew, everything's all right. Brain chemicals, of course, are sky high again, and then again you're brought back into the devaluation phase. And that's an essential part of the abuse. Those two things, the hot and cold, is an essential part of the abuse, because of the way that it plays havoc with the brain chemicals, because it's actually an addictive cycle. So the cycles are of varying lengths, and the love bombing and the devaluations are of varying sizes. So you don't know whether you're coming or going. You don't go, oh, I'm in the cycle of idealize and devalue, you know. You just don't know what's going on, you know. You don't notice that there's a cycle at all, especially because it's all so variable. But that's an addictive cycle from a neurochemical perspective. It's just like when you're playing a slot machine, for example, you know, the wins and the losses and the how long is it going to be before I win again, and a tiny win or a big win or a small, you know, that it's exactly the same. It's highly, highly addictive. So, you know, when I say you become addicted to the narcissist, I mean it. You know, and people will actually say they can't leave because they feel literally addicted to the narcissist. And I don't know if you've heard the term trauma bonding, but if you have, that's what I'm talking about. That's trauma bonding.
Yeah, it reminds me everything you've just said about the cycle and about the devaluing part and then the idealization very much reminds me of physically abusive relationships, because it's a similar cycle, isn't it? You know, the cycle of physical abuse and then the abuser being incredibly sorry and loving and caring, and it's well, it won't, he says it won't happen again, or she says it won't happen again, and you know, they're very, very sorry for what they've done, and then that comes around again, and it sounds like a very similar cycle.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I suppose the difference is that with narcissism, it's usually much, much, much more subtle than that. Yeah. Sure. You know, and there's always covert psychological abuse involved in narcissism. There can be physical abuse as well, but it tends not to be such a big feature, but it depends on the narcissist. If they're not very good at self-regulating, then, you know, you'll get that kind of physical abuse side of it as well. Mm-hmm. Or as things spiral out of control, often towards the end of a relationship, they might sort of decompensate and start, you know, the physical abuse. But in general, you know, narcissistic abuse, I mean, there's always that psychological component. It's not just physical. And
it's that subtlety, I guess, that makes it it's sort of almost difficult to, I suppose, to recognize it happening to you in the early stages, because it's not a black eye or a,
exactly.
Do you know what I mean?
But, you know, it's just a bit of a critical comment. But and you know, if you think about the you know, your arms look a bit fat in that top kind of thing. Well, oh yeah, they do a bit, don't they? Well, you're only telling me because you don't want me to go out looking. You know, you want me to feel good when you know, it's disguised as I want you to feel good. You know, I think you're fantastic. But so it's really cleverly done. You know, so that you don't think, oh, I'm being devalued. It doesn't feel like you're being devalued. It feels it's disguised as something else, or it's disguised as a joke. You know. Oh, you're being sensitive, you know, I was only joking, you know, so it's not easy to spot, not at all.
No, it's not, is it? So as the relationship goes on, I suppose the first question to ask is, do all relationships with someone with narcissistic personality disorder, do they all end, or do they sometimes progress and be I'm careful of using happy ever after, but kind of marriages that last a lifetime?
Yeah, they can last a lifetime, but they are toxic, and the victim of narcissistic abuse is very, very unhappy if they do last. And, you know, I mean, I've seen this so many times. You know, we're lucky now. We've got Google, you know, for all its faults, we can put in, oh, you know, this happened and that happened. And some, you know, you might just chance upon the answer, oh my God, this is narcissism or whatever. Sure. But, you know, back in the day, that wasn't the case. And so many of these toxic relationships that, you know, in your parents or of their generation, you know, they lasted forever because the victim really didn't know. And of course, they're isolated as well. It's part of the abuse tactics is to try to remove your friends and your family from you. So you're sort of on your own. You haven't got a sort of reference point, you know. So a lot of those relationships, certainly in the old days, just went on forever. But nowadays, they do tend to come to a close, I think.
And is there something from your experience, is there usually a trigger that happens that makes the victim of this abuse realize, or do you feel that it's a mounting of accumulation of what's happened in the past?
Yeah, I don't think people, it's always an accumulation, certainly.
Sure.
But a lot of people nowadays, anyway, because that that narcissism word is out there, maybe incorrectly used, but still, at least it's out there, and so a lot of my clients come to me and say, oh, my especially with the older ones, my son thought that, dad's a narcissist, or, whatever. They'll be told by somebody who is sort of, in the know, or just kind of, aware of what the words that are out there, or, they end up in therapy, and sometimes the therapist has picked up on it, often not though, or, or they've just, they've discovered the word in some way. And when they've discovered the word and they've done their research, that usually that's kind of a trigger for, for them thinking, well, I've got to find out whether this is true, because it's very confusing for a long time. And then if it is, inevitably they will end up leaving. But it might take a few attempts.
Yes. Okay. Let's move on to that, because that seems like a sensible place to go from here. From the clients that I've worked with who have been in this position, and from the reading that I've done, the leaving part can be incredibly difficult. I suppose, do you have any advice for somebody who is in that position, who knows that they need to leave, as to how? Because I guess that's the starting point, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult. I mean, I mentioned the book, the book that is actually, I mean, you've got the other one, you've got the Practitioner's Guide. The book for the spouse kind of takes that person by the hand and actually walks them through why they're so confused, why they've been so confused for so long, and how to sort of actually recognize, because it's really coming to, once you understand what narcissism is, and the fact that you can't change it, they can't be cured of this thing. And it's actually not about you anyway. It's about them. It's completely about them. But that doesn't help when you've given 20 years of your life or whatever, thinking that you were in love, and I think when you realize that it can't be changed, and that they can't actually love, and they can't actually care, that's usually the point at which people decide to go. But you've got to, I mean, you will know all about this, but it's about preparing yourself and making, being safe. And certainly from a financial perspective, and trying to be as safe as you can from an emotional perspective, because that narcissist is going to try and annihilate you. So it's being prepared for what's about to come, basically. And that's financially, that's just usually absolutely diabolical, because the narcissist will try to literally, their sense of entitlement, that bit that I mentioned, part of the really important part of narcissism, means that they think they're entitled to absolutely everything, and that you're entitled to absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
And so, and you've seen that, and it's just you can't make any sense of it. There's no logic to this. It really is just the way that they're wired. They genuinely believe that. And, to their own detriment, they'll take the financial pot and they will flush it down the loo. They will remove money, throw it away, give it away, spend it on unnecessary things. They'll actually, they'll see that the rage is so great and the desire to annihilate is so great that they'll actually reduce the financial pot so that there's nothing in it for you, even to their own detriment. So yeah, it's being aware of those things, and preparing yourself. And there's no getting, as I always say to my clients, the only way out is through. You're gonna have to go through this hell. But it's one of those situations where the grass is very definitely greener on the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's funny, one of the things that you hear people sometimes say in divorce, and less so at the moment, I think, but I'm going to take them for everything that they've got, and you kind of go, well, that is not a great way of looking at it. You're going to end up through the courts, you'll spend an absolute fortune on lawyers and barristers and so on, and if you end up having to go to a final hearing, it's tens of thousands that you will have spent on it. And that's fine telling the victim that, and they'll totally understand and believe you, but then you've got the other side, and if the other side is absolutely determined, as you've said, to do that and doesn't really care if it's going to cost tens of thousands of pounds, then it's a huge problem. So okay, so the victim has left. How do you, I know I was reading your website earlier, and you said that there are it's about knowing what the pattern of behavior is going to be, because although it's cunning and devious, it is a pattern of behavior that if you're pre-warned, you can navigate through. So victim has left. What now?
Well, victims left. Well, that's sort of simplifying it, because
I realise that
they're in the house, aren't they? Quite often the narcissist won't move out, so the victim has left in terms of they're saying they want a divorce, but they're still in the house because there's nowhere else for them to go, and they're still being abused. Now the narcissist, of course, has ramped up their abuse, and they've probably brought in boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, and they're sort of parading this person around under the victim's nose, and that theoretically destabilizes them further. So, you know, their emotional state is just absolutely dreadful. So there's just so much to this, because, you know, they've got to try to manage their emotional state, which is just horrendous. They're going to have they've got to do all the practical things, like they've got to change their emails. You know, narcissists love abusing via tech abuse. You know, they'll stalk, they'll hack into computers, and they'll hack into your phone, or if they don't actually do it, they'll tell you they're doing it so that they mentally destabilize you. And so you think that everything you're writing is, I mean, it's dreadful. It's truly dreadful. So, you know, it's doing all those very sensible things. It's things like with the joint accounts, you know, 2 signatures if you can, or because they'll take money from joint accounts, they'll run up credit card bills, they'll you know, as I've said, they'll give money away. If they're in business themselves, they'll get colleagues to put in fake invoices for inflated claims, and then they'll, you know, get the money back after the divorce. They'll get their accountant to write a letter saying that their tax bill is going to be this much, and which it technically could be, I suppose, but quite often they've reduced their earnings around the time of the divorce. So actually they're paying on account for money that, so they'd get a rebate, in other words, and they'll get that rebate after the divorce, and it could be, you know, tens of thousands of pounds. So all these sneaky things are going on, and you just have to be one step ahead of all of it. You know, you've got to change your will so that they're not a beneficiary early on. And there's, you know, so many kind of communication strategies that you need to employ, because the narcissist is going to be, well, I mean, I use that word annihilate, and I mean it, but from an emotional perspective, they're going to be wearing you down, and you'll be thinking, I wish I'd never started this divorce process. And also at the same time, probably trying to rope you back into the relationship as well. So they'll be, you know, alternately love bombing you again. The hoovering phase is where they love bomb, but even more than ever before, and they turn into the perfect person again. And that's why it's so hard. So that's why, you know, you've probably been involved in cases where they've said, I'm leaving, and then they've gone, I'm not leaving, and then they come back to you 6 months later, I'm leaving again. You know, it takes 7 attempts to leave an abusive relationship. And narcissistically abused. Yes, I mean, I can see you going, oh my God, I'm exhausted. And it's exhausting.
Just to, I mean, 7 times to break to try and break free, and before you finally get there, and in the meantime you're in the middle of this whole cycle, which just, I mean, it must,
the courage of these people that leave, honestly, it is not to be underestimated. I mean, you know, it is a momentous decision that they make when they leave, but they know what's coming usually, or they know how, they're not sure of exactly what's coming if they don't understand narcissism fully, and they don't know that's what they're dealing with, but they know that it's going to be bad. I mean, the narcissist will have threatened to financially destroy them. You know, they'll threaten to burn down the house, take the children, you know, take the car. They often do take the car. You know, I mean, it's very common to leave. You know, it's just that, you know, they'll do absolutely everything they can. They'll take the photos of the children when they were little, you know, and they'll take your computer, you know, or they'll just all sorts of things. They'll take you off the account that you've got of your own children's photos. You know, they'll remove you from that. They'll do all these sort of awful kind of emotional abuse tactics that really, you know, hurt a parent, or they'll use the children as weapons of abuse. They'll, maybe if they're at private school, they'll stop paying school fees so that the lower earning parents has to pay, or you know, they'll stop paying for extracurricular things. So they'll happily use the children as weapons of abuse. you know, to try to fight, they'll badmouth you to everyone, you know, everyone that will listen. And of course, they're charming and they're plausible, that false persona. And they may have been priming all these people for a long time. And so these people will think worse than anything. You won't have a support network quite often, apart from your absolute nearest and dearest. And everyone else will think that you are this terrible person, and they'll project what they've been doing onto you. So they'll say you're the one that's, you know, they'll tell all their friends, you had affairs, you did this, you did that, you know, and and this happens, I mean, it happens pretty much every time. You know, I hear this all the time. And as I say, you know, you pointed out, it's a pattern. It is very much a pattern. So to know that that's what's coming, and to leave knowing that that's what's coming is just, I mean, it's almost better not to know in some ways, but then you'll be financially and emotionally destroyed. So it's better to know and to go, I'm going to go through this, you know, I'm going to do this. Because the alternative is to be in what is essentially a loveless marriage, because they can't love. There'll never be mutually reciprocated love or respect. You'll never be cherished. And the children will similarly never really have you know, it's a very, extremely damaging situation for the children. So that courage is just so great to be able to actually to do that and to leave. And I really want professionals to understand that and to be, you know, empathic, and, you know, because it's so important. They need to support their clients if that's what they're going through.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Everything that you've just said is so frighteningly familiar, not on a personal level, I'm pleased to say, but from clients who I've watched go through it. It's touching my heart with the client that I started working with probably about 3, maybe a little bit more years ago. She did leave. Thankfully, she's out the other side now and is putting her life back together again. But it is taking an inordinate amount of time, because as you have just very eloquently described, the way in which he systematically removed all of her friends from her life, and even turned pretty much everybody in the town in which she lives against her, and making them think that she was the bad guy.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the really difficult things, isn't it? Because they're charming. Generally, you said that before, you know, the person with this disorder tends to be very, very charming, tends to win over people very, very easily. And your trust is kind of like, well, hang on, where do I put my trust in this situation? It's just so incredibly difficult. So where should, I mean, my starting point with working with clients is they tend to come and see me quite early on in the process. It tends to be either just before they've left or just after they've left. And I have had one or two who have done exactly what you described and gone back. But generally, once they've left, my starting point is to say, you need to go and find some emotional support and help first. Would your advice be the same, or would you take a different approach if somebody was coming out of this sort of relationship?
It's really, really important that when they get emotional support, they get it from someone who understands narcissistic personality disorder. Sure. And that is just so important, because people go to counseling and they go to therapy, and it doesn't work. In fact, it can make it worse quite often, because the majority of therapists and the majority of counselors don't have a deep understanding of it. So they sort of, you know, they continue to invalidate what the person is saying, because they can't really understand what's going on, why anyone would behave in this way, and it can't really be true. And they just don't really, you know, and also they sort of make it about the person, because that's what therapy is about. It's about the person sitting opposite you, isn't it? You know, so you'd sort of, you know, you'd make it all about them. But actually this stuff is happening to them, and it's actually not their fault. But a therapist would go, you know, well, what can you do to sort of, you know, how can you respond differently? And they'll make it about this. If they don't know what they're dealing with, they can actually invalidate that person's experiences. So emotional support, really, really important. But if you're going to get professional emotional help, you know, they better really understand what narcissism is, really, really, really understand it, not just have a vague idea, but deeply understand it. Otherwise, they can actually make things worse. And again, you know, it's important. I mean, it's so hard with friends, etc. But if you've got one or two friends that actually will really listen and really go along with you and do the Googling with you to understand narcissism themselves, that's just a huge, it can be as much of a help as actually sitting with a therapist, having a genuine friend who wants to understand it with you, who wants to really work it out with you so that they can support you. I mean, it's a lot to ask of any non-professional, but sometimes that kind of relationship is, you know, is even more effective in holding it together. Because, you know, if you're leaving a narcissist, you're being abused through the divorce process, and they've ramped up the abuse. Yeah. So how can you heal when you're continually being abused? I mean, you can't really, you know. It's so the best that a therapist can do during the divorce process really is just validate your experiences and be there and listen and you know, and make sure you understand that this isn't you and it's not your fault. And, you know, but they can't actually make you any better at this point because you're still being abused. So it's just a continual process. But yeah, they need some emotional support.
And I assume from what you've said that having somebody there to keep reminding you that it's not your fault and that your experiences are real and that you've not made them up, is really important. Even though the person you're working with might not be able to help you kind of sort of cure you, that seems the wrong word, but help you to start getting better.
Help you to heal.
But it's useful, it's important to have that support and that constant, it's not you.
And that validation of your experiences, this is really happening to you and you are not reacting in a way that is abnormal. And, you know, this isn't depression, this isn't anxiety. This is trauma, you know, and you are reacting in a perfectly reasonable way. The fact that you're shouting and crying and 1 minute you're, you know, up and 1 minute you're down and, you know, you don't know what to do and you have fleeting thoughts about suicide or whatever. I mean, obviously, you know, if you do, then that's, you know, but if you're not, it just is fleeting and you're not planning anything, then those things are actually normal in this situation. And just to have somebody validate you and say, you know, this is as a result of your experiences. And you know, and it's okay, and you're going to get through this. I mean, it's so important because the narcissist has invalidated you throughout. They've gaslit you. I don't know if that's one of the things they do. They gaslight, you know. So they lie and they make you, it's a kind of two-step lie. So they lie about something, but they make you then question your perceptions of it. So they might say that never happened, this happened, and, you know, or she never said that, she said this, or you know, you're remembering that wrong, or even your feelings are wrong. So if you say, I'm feeling my dog's died, I'm feeling sad. Well, you shouldn't be feeling sad about your dog dying. You should be feeling sorry for me because I'm working so hard at work and I haven't got time to mourn the loss of the dog or whatever. And you're like, oh, I should be feeling sorry for you. You know, your whole sort of everything is kind of questioned, and you just stop trusting yourself in a narcissistic relationship. So you've been invalidated. Your feelings, your memory, your perceptions, everything's been invalidated, and you just don't trust anything. So you need someone to start validating you again. It's very, very important indeed. You know, I mean, it's a really difficult situation for people.
It really is, isn't it? And I suppose that on top of having somebody there who's giving you emotional support, this is where the other divorce professionals like myself, like lawyers, like mediators, also need to understand this disorder, because it's important that we fully believe the person who's in front of us and trust what they're saying as well. Because if they're constantly being questioned in the relationship and made to distrust their own version of events and so on, they need to be believed. And this is something that that Dr. Rachel said last week in the fortnight ago in the podcast, that she felt that what she really wanted more than anything was for somebody to believe her, and that was the most important thing for her. And I guess that's where your work comes in with training other divorce professionals in this area.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, but there's a little twist to this as well, because we have to, in our training, we have to tell them this. Yes, of course there is. There wouldn't be. you know,
It wouldn't be straightforward, would it?
No. So you know, the problem is that very often a narcissist will present to a divorce professional or legal professional, and you know, and say my spouse is a narcissist. They'll be projecting their own narcissism onto the spouse, so that makes it really difficult. So you can't just kind of blanket believe them. You have to look out. And this is one of the things that we train legal professionals in as well, is, you know, the signs, how to spot when the narcissist, the person coming to you saying their spouse is a narcissist, is actually the narcissist themselves. And also how to spot when the person coming to you saying their spouse is a narcissist is they're not a narcissist, they're just being a bit mean, or, you know, because a real narcissist is doing all those dreadful things I've described already. Sure. But, you know, don't confuse the word for the sort of colloquial term, you know. So they've got to be able to differentiate between those, you know, the narcissists themselves saying their spouse is narcissist and the people who would just get using the word incorrectly. So actually just blanket believing them isn't helpful either, and you can make things worse. Yeah, so it's really important to for people to understand that, you know. So yeah, I mean, it's a big part of what we do in our training of lawyers, is teaching
like
them.
An utter minefield. I'm very glad I've ordered your book, because I feel even more like I'm going to need it now. I knew it was a minefield, and now I really, really feel that it completely is a minefield. You mentioned a little while ago when we were talking about emotional support, about it being very important that somebody who has been a victim of this kind of abuse, that they find somebody who really has a deep understanding of this disorder, other than coming to yourself, because I'm sure that you've got plenty of clients, but I'm sure that, you know, and people can contact you, and we'll put your details in the show notes. But other than you, how do they make sure that they're finding somebody who really, really understands this?
I mean, there are a few narcissistic abuse recovery coaches. So Googling them, if they're specializing in that, then, you know, you don't specialize in that without having, I think, a reasonable understanding, because this isn't an easy field to go into at all. So generally speaking, you know, people who've chosen to go into it would, you know, and marketing themselves in that way do have a deep understanding of it. Because, as I say, it's not something you wouldn't particularly want. These are difficult clients, you know. It's not, you know, it's not a sort of in out job, you know. You're sorted now, you're fine. I mean,
6 weeks later you're off.
You're cured. Fantastic. You know, and there's a lot to do, you know, working with these clients. So I would, you know, Google narcissistic abuse recovery coaches. That's one way to do it. And also, you know, looking at sort of psychotherapists' websites, etc., and actually ringing them up and saying, do you have specific? I mean, if they do, it will usually be on the website. Most don't, I have to say. The majority don't. But I mean, on our own podcast, actually, we interview a clinical psychologist who specializes in this field, and you know, I mean, again, you know, she's completely overrun because there's an awful lot of work in this area. But you know, people are out there and people are doing it, but it's a case of speaking to them, really finding out what they do understand it. And the same, of course, with lawyers. You know, I mean, if your lawyer doesn't understand it, they might tell you they do. They might go, oh, yes, that's high conflict, or, you know, but it's not just high conflict. There is an underlying personality disorder. It is not just a high conflict. So then when they actually take on the case, they deal with it and mismanage it really badly, and lose, you know, tens of thousands, maybe even over £100,000, you know, for their client, because they've mismanaged it. So it's so important to find a legal professional who really understands it, not just someone who says they do. Not just someone who's written a blog about it, you know.
Yeah, which is, and it is easy to think that you understand it and not have that deep understanding that you're talking about, because it is sadly relatively commonplace.
Yes, it is.
I guess, and we've talked about the fact that the word narcissist is used so commonly, and for someone being a bit mean as opposed to the true sense of the word. But I get the impression that even people with narcissistic personality disorder is not uncommon either. Would I be right in saying that?
Yeah, so most people agree that it's not that people it's about 5% of the population would qualify for a diagnosis of NPD. So that's pretty big, isn't it? One in 20.
Huge.
Yeah. Now, whether that's right or not, now figures vary. So a lot of the studies are American. Some say 0.5%, some say 6.2%. So those are the two extremes. So most people agree it's around 5%. But of course, narcissists don't go, oh, put me in your study, I'm one. I mean, so, it's quite hard to do, isn't it? And by definition, they're not going to sort of admit to being, to all these things, because the false persona is a false persona. It allows them to manipulate others for their own gain. So they're not going to sort of admit to it because it's not in their interest to do so. And they probably have no awareness. The vast majority of narcissists have no awareness that they're narcissists anyway. So, it's pretty difficult to actually put a proper figure on it, but, 5%. And if you consider that, I always sort of, use the analogy of a solar system. So the narcissist is the sun in a solar system, and there are all these planets orbiting this sun in different orbits, further and further away. And the closest one is the spouse, and possibly around the other side where they can't be seen, the lover, of the narcissist. And then, then the family members, and then the friends, and then the work colleagues, et cetera, and the builder, then the postman, all these people are sort of orbiting this person. And none of them really, the closer you are, the more abusive behaviors you're going to be subjected to, but also the more confused you're going to be by them, because you're going to be spun around this sort of cycle of idealize and devalue. But the further out you are, you're not going to be spun quite as much in the cycle of idealize and devalue, but you're further away, so you don't get it either. You don't really see the devalue. So each narcissist is affecting how many people? So it might be 5%, but it's a lot more people than that are actually affected. So, and it seems to be that it could be on the increase. It does appear that it could be on the increase.
Yeah, it's it does definitely feel like that. You always kind of wonder, because we've got a greater awareness of it, and people are more happy more people, because more people are aware of it, I guess more people are seeking help because of it.
Yeah.
And therefore it's are there more people around, or are we more aware, is I guess a question that we're probably not going to know the answer to.
No, but then it should, if you think about it, if one narcissist has 3 children, and 2 of them turn into narcissists, and then they go on to, you can kind of see how it would be,
how it could grow. And
social media is kind of pandering to that as well. So perhaps is it making people more narcissistic, or are they just more visible now because you see them on social media? It's a place for them to be, it's a place for them to get their external validation. And we value wealth and status and power and all of that, and those are very narcissistic things to go for. Do we kind of feed that? Does society feed that and make people more narcissistic? I mean, I don't know the answer, and I don't think anybody does. There's a book called The Narcissism Epidemic, which, it's controversial in some circles, but but many people say, it does show clearly that narcissism is on the increase. Some psychotherapists, psychologists say it doesn't show it clearly, but, only time will tell, really. Yeah. But certainly it seems to be. We're definitely more aware, I think, now. Yeah. Mr. Trump has helped enormously, of course.
I guess the awareness is a good thing, because being aware means that people who are victims of this will become hopefully more aware, and the people who are going to help them out are more aware of the situation.
Can I tell you what's really important about that?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
When you leave your narcissistic spouse, if your children are little, you break the cycle of generational abuse. You break that proper, those children have a better chance of not becoming narcissistic themselves, because they're away relatively, for some of the time at least, even if it's only 50-50, they're away from that narcissist, and they can see the difference in the parenting styles, because the other parent is no longer living in the house with the narcissist, enabling the narcissistic behaviors, that are happening to the children. So you're actually breaking the cycle and you're stopping that propagation. And that's why it's so important to pluck up that courage and leave. If you can't do it for yourself, do it for your children.
Yeah. Absolutely. I could really talk to you for hours and hours, because this is a horrific but fascinating subject, and I feel like we've barely skimmed the surface. But I think I might order your other book as well. Get
That's the client-facing book, and it's the one with the emotional support as well, you know. And I mean, it's been selling incredibly well, so we're very pleased, because we knew this was a huge problem, but even we are surprised at just how big a problem it's turned out to be, and the demand, for people to actually get hold of the book is just incredible, really. So hopefully we're making a difference.
Well, it's great that they're getting hold of your book, and I'm sure that will be making a difference to a lot of people. Massive thank you for joining me today. We'll make sure that all your contact details are put in the show notes, along with links to the pages to order the book. I know your client-facing one is available on Amazon, isn't it? And
yeah, it's everywhere. It's Waterstones
everywhere.
That's the client-facing one with a big heart on the front. That's Divorcing a Narcissist: The Lure, the Loss, and the Law. And yeah, the other one is this one, actually. This one here with
well, it's a tome. That's going to take me a bit of time to read.
Well, people say they kind of, it's a page turner, because they start realizing, oh my God, my aunt's a narcissist and my uncle, and you just sort of, so it is a bit of a page turner. That's what I've been told anyway. So
fantastic. Many thanks for joining me. It's an absolute pleasure to speak to you. I feel like I know more, and I kind of feel like I know less than I did before. But it's been a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on.